So, Siddhant Adlaka, let's dive into The Incredible Hulk. We recently rewatched this movie to celebrate She-Hulk episode 2. And I want to ask you, what were your overall thoughts on this viewing of the film?
You know, final battle aside, which has been a problem with Marvel for a very long time, it seems, I enjoyed it a lot more than I thought I would going back because the last time I saw it was maybe, I don't know, 3 years ago or something like that. But this time I was struck by how different it feels from all of the current Marvel stuff. And by current, I mean like the last decade of Marvel stuff. Um, every time the tension or the drama wasn't cut by a joke, I found myself pleasantly surprised. Because, of
What's
course,
interesting is that the humor in this movie feels extremely actually out of place, I would argue. Like, there are some funny moments, but they feel like very weird compared to like humor is a very much core to the DNA of the modern Marvel films, like people undercutting serious moments with jokes and quips and one-liners. That happens all the time now. But like when it happened in this movie, it was like, ooh, that's feels like not really quite right.
yeah, it feels very much like a product of the 2000s in terms of the operatic and to an extent unapologetic nature of superhero movies at the time. Whether or not they were good, you could expect something that had like this blaring orchestral score and that wasn't a joke fest every 5 seconds.
Totally. I enjoyed this movie a lot more than I remembered, and I think it's because of what you described, which is that it does feel really different than a lot of the Marvel stuff we've gotten before. Um, and at the same time, it's also fascinating to consider what they carried over from this movie, right? There's like a
Hmm.
couple elements that they carried over. Obviously, Emil Blonsky, both the actor and the character, but Thaddeus Ross,
Hmm.
played by William Hurt. I had honestly completely forgotten, to be honest with you, that he was in this movie, and he became a core part of the MCU. He appeared in multiple MCU movies afterwards. So, yep, go ahead.
Yeah, the first movie he shows up in after the Incredible Hulk in 2008 is Captain America: Civil War. 8 years later, which is when they finally decided, okay, we can still use the stuff from that movie. And there's one small reference to it in the Avengers where Mark Ruffalo says, "The last time I was in New York, I kind of broke Harlem," which is what happens at the end of this movie. But apart from that, it never really felt like they were bringing this movie forward into the rest of the MCU. Certainly not tonally, but of course, different actor, a completely different appearance for the Hulk. Not just because it's a different actor, but like a different approach to designing the Hulk. Um, but yeah, it feels so tonally dissonant from the rest of the Marvel universe. And I'm not saying that as a complaint,
No,
especially now, all these years later, when we're kind of craving something that breaks that mold. Um, But even if you go back and look at the original Iron Man from 2008, that kind of tone has sort of stuck because you have the very, quippy Tony Stark dialogue. In this, you don't have as much of that. And what little bits of humor you do have aren't so much, quips and dialogue based as they are like, small little character things like when they're driving the cab in New York and Bruce Banner's heart rate monitor starts increasing, like small little things like that.
yeah, yeah. I would say that one of my favorite parts about this movie is how it looks.
Yeah.
It looks like a normal movie, and what I mean by that is it has the normal amount of dynamic range.
Hmm.
The colors pop. This is not true of all Marvel films.
Hmm.
See your colleague Patrick Williams' video essay about this topic, but yeah, like it's like, oh wow, high contrast and like kind of gritty film. I think it was probably made on film, is my guess.
It was.
But it looks great, like a normal action movie with some horror sci-fi elements to it. Does get very campy at times,
Yeah.
but I like the way it looks, and I like how much it feels like just a conventional movie that doesn't really have that many tie-ins with the rest of the universe. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, because it was still kind of laying the foundation for stuff they hadn't fully figured out yet. So going back all these years later, you start to find these connections like Captain America and the rest of the Avengers and all that. But yeah, at the time it was more concerned with just being a movie unto itself, and the only thing that really feels like it's connected is once again the final scene, which really feels like it was meant to be a post-credit sequence. But I don't think very many people stuck around for the post-credit scene in the first Iron Man, because that, for younger listeners, that wasn't really a thing people would do. Like sitting through the
Hmm.
credits,
Hmm.
no way, no chance.
Yeah.
um but and like you said, the look of it is really alluring. And you can sort of break that down to like, well, they used to shoot on film back then and now it's digital. But I wouldn't say it's as simple, just because you can achieve that sort of textured high contrast look with digital as well. It's just that Marvel's workflow, as Patrick explains in his video, has become this very standard thing where they, you know the amount of color correction they do or do not do leads to this sort of flat low contrast look. Whereas the work done on this, whatever process they used in post, um, yields this very vibrant fabric. You get an immediate sense of it, not just like during the opening montage, but when you see Bruce Banner in Brazil, you almost feel like the heat radiating off the factory and the environment. And
Mm.
it's a movie with a
There's a lot of
real,
texture, a lot of
yeah,
texture to the movie. Yeah,
it's a movie with a
visually.
real
Yeah.
sense of place always, like whether it's raining, whether they're on the streets of New York, whether they're in a forest. It very rarely feels like it was shot. I don't want to say it rarely feels like it was shot on a stage, but it doesn't feel like they shot it on a stage with the intention of making these decisions later. So
Hmm.
whether they're
Hmm.
shooting on location or in a studio space, you can tell that the lighting and the design and all the decisions are sort of geared towards grounding you in like a tangible space.
Yes, I would agree that there is some CG in the movie, and some of it is pretty rough. I'm
Yeah.
not going to lie about that. But I would agree with you that for the most part, it feels like they went on location. They actually shot on places. They actually shot in actual physical places, not on the volume. Like all these things are true. It's also interesting to reflect on some of the things that this movie has that Marvel films don't really have anymore. Here's a couple of them. One of them is any hint of sex. Like
Hmm.
Marvel movies don't really have that anymore. Whereas, like, there
Hmm.
is this awkward scene in this movie where they almost have sex, and it becomes like an awkward joke. But it's like, oh wow, like that probably wouldn't even happen in most modern Marvel films, right?
Yeah.
Which is kind of a bummer because I think movies should depict the full panoply of human experience, and we don't get that with Marvel. I'm not saying there should be sex scenes or anything. I'm just saying like romance, something in is missing from a lot of modern Marvel movies.
Yeah,
Um,
and not just the presence of romance, but the way it's shot. Because in the moments where Bruce first lays eyes on Betty after years and years in hiding, it feels like time kind of stands still. The first time their eyes meet in the rain, then the moment where they're both lying down in their separate beds and looking up at the ceiling, the way
right.
that the way it's framed and cut together is like you can feel that there is a connection between them, and also something standing in their way, like just through the aesthetics. It doesn't take someone putting it into words for you to understand it. And the music is also a big part of that too.
The other thing I would say is I think this movie is also much more violent and brutal than a lot of modern Marvel films.
For sure.
Specifically with what happens to Emil Blonsky's character. There's like some body horror elements to it,
Hmm.
But just like when Emil Blonsky gets completely annihilated by the Hulk, and he's in the hospital bed, it's like, ooh, this is like a violent, brutal world that this movie has created, and it's just rare to see that these days in the MCU. So those are a couple things that stuck out to me about like, oh, like remember when movies used to be this way and a little bit more risky and distinct.
Hmm.
What Marvel has been able to accomplish is very admirable. I'm not saying like the new way is objectively worse. I'm just saying it's different, and it used to be more distinctive, I think, than it
Yeah.
is today. So,
Yeah, and another thing that was also noticeable, this is probably the only Marvel film where the US government and not some fictitious agency, like the actual US government, the actual US military are the bad guys.
mm,
And there is, of course, this wider conversation about Marvel Studios ties to the US military, which they're not alone in that. Like a lot of Hollywood productions have DoD production agreements, that's the Department of Defense. And because of that, they're, meant to portray the US military in, if not in a positive light, then at least not in a negative light. But this seems to be the only one where the actual real life US military are the ostensible villains until, Emil Blonsky, takes that role towards the end. But yeah, they're unambiguously like the bad guys when this movie begins.
hmm hmm So why don't we talk about some of the kind of main arcs or highlights of the film, right? I remember texting you when I was watching this movie, or after I watched it. I was like, the first 30 to 40 minutes of this movie rips. I actually really like the first 30 to 40 minutes because basically what they do in this movie is they do all the origin story stuff in the credits, which I
Mm-hmm.
actually thought was pretty cool. Because I think they kind of assumed that you had seen the Hulk, the other Hulk movie. And so they're
Yeah.
like, we don't need to go over that because it wasn't even that long before this movie
Yep.
came out. I think is what
Five
the Ong
years.
Lee Hulk was 2002, right?
Three.
2003. So
Yep.
it was like 5 years before. So they're like, okay, you probably already seen that movie. So like, we don't need to go over all the origin story. So we'll put it on the credits. Now, having read the backstory behind this movie, apparently there was like a bunch more origin story stuff that was filmed, and they didn't know exactly where to put it. I actually think it was a smart move to put it in the opening credits, dispense with it. They do cover it via dialogue later on, but
Mm-hmm.
felt like a smart move to me. What did you think, Siddhant?
Yeah, when I first watched it, look, I didn't, know anything about the ins and outs of like, production and contracts and reboots and this and that. To me, it was just okay. They made a Hulk movie 5 years ago, and now they're making another Hulk movie. Different actor, sure. I've seen like five different Batmans. That makes sense to me. And so just it was just sort of a given, back then that yeah, okay, they're making another one. We don't have to sit and like pick through like the connections and like, is it technically a sequel? Is it this? Is it that? Because like you said, just 5 years prior, I'd seen the other Hulk movie, and I just, I didn't have words for it at the time. I just took this as like sort of a soft reboot because the Ang Lee Hulk movie ends with Bruce Banner hiding out in the Amazon, and this one, opens with him hiding out in Brazil, and so it could conceivably be like, a sequel to it. So again, like, with the assumption that how the Hulk became the Hulk, the movie, it doesn't hold your hand through it. It kind of just, you know condenses it for the people who don't know, like, yeah, hey, experiment gone wrong. And yeah, and you open with, his journey being set up as being about, whether or not he can control this side of himself, whether
Right.
or not he can, quote unquote, cure his hulkiness.
Yeah. I would say honestly, most of my problems with this movie come in the last third. Like the
Yeah.
first two thirds, I actually really like. The first third of the movie, he's kind of out there at this Brazilian bottling plant,
Hmm.
trying to avoid becoming the Hulk, working with this guy named Mister Blue
Hmm.
to engineer some kind of solution so that he can not be Hulk anymore and kind of go back and be with Betty. I think is kind of the sense that
Yeah.
we get. Um, there's a fairly, but there's a fairly hilarious moment when Thaddeus Ross is like, "Oh, somebody drank some soda and got some gamma radiation in the blood," and he's like, "Where's that bottling plant?" And it's like, really, like that's the thing you go to, not like where was the convenience store where he bought the bottle? Where was the who's delivered it to him? You know, who touched it before they delivered it to him? You know, like uh
To be fair, it seems like, the assumption is that the blood was in the bottle and the bottle
yes.
was sealed. But I found the
But he
funnier
really
line.
put that together real fast in like three
Yeah,
seconds. So
I
yeah.
found the funnier line to be like, "Find me the one white guy at that bottling plant," because like, oh man, Brazil, surely there can't be any white people in South America.
Tell me if they've seen a white gangly dude at the bottling plant. Yeah. Anyway, but the whole chase sequence and then the whole like Hulk coming out and for the
Yeah.
first time you see him and like he's in darkness and night vision, like that's all really well done. I found like I just
Yeah.
thought it was like a great chase sequence. Again, it looks like they did it practically. It doesn't look like they did it on the volume. Like it looks like just really exhilarating sort of classical action filmmaking.
Yeah, and even
Yeah.
for the bits where, when he does eventually Hulk out, and the Hulk CG, it's not great in most of this movie, but at the same time, it really gives you a sense of how much all the other elements work in tandem to either disguise it or complement it. Because the first time you see the Hulk, he kind of, it's just a close up of his face popping out of the shadows. And if you were to pause that moment, of course, like, the Hulk would look like completely uncanny and quote unquote unrealistic. But it's such a well put together scene that the lack of finesse when it comes to CGI, whatever the reasons were at the time, whether it was the technology, whether things were rushed through, probably not as much as now, but all the other elements worked much better in tandem than they do today. Because if you have a Hulk that looks like that now, nothing else around him is going to look much better either.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think I know what you're saying. You're basically saying like there was a kind of cohesiveness to a lot of the look of this film that sometimes isn't found in modern Marvel films. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. For whatever reason, uh,
Hmm.
the vision behind it, the way that Marvel works its visual effects workflow, like any number of things
Yeah.
can cause it.
Something as simple as how a scene is lit on set, whereas nowadays you might have scenarios where those decisions aren't being made on set at all.
Right. Right. So big fight at the bottling plant. It's like just a bunch of amazing moments in the fight.
Hmm.
Uh, Emil Blonsky shooting a dog. It's just like, oh, that's a very efficient way. Not a happy moment. It's just like efficient characterization. It's like, oh, you get that he's kind of an asshole.
Yeah, take
Like right
that,
off the
Blake
bat.
Snyder.
Yeah, and just some really tense moments with like Hulk pushing this gigantic tank through the floor, and then like people being crushed and diving out of the way, and
Hmm.
just feeling like you're just overwhelmed by this thing. You have no idea what it is. It's really well done. So I
Hmm.
like this whole kind of chase sequence, and it's at the end of a chase sequence. So
Yeah.
it's a really solid chase sequence, and then like this big action scene, and it's like, oh wow, like at this point I'm like really in this movie. I'm really like, ooh, like
Yeah.
maybe people this did not deserve to get as reviewed as poorly as it did back in the day.
Yeah.
That was my reaction.
Yeah.
Um, at this point in the movie.
Yeah, because just looking at it as a whole, I think until that very final battle, I think I would say I really like this movie.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So then he kind of travels home, right?
Hmm.
Returns to Culver City, reunites with Betty. I don't know about you, I felt a little bit bad for Ty Burrell, who's in
Yeah.
this movie. She kind of just gets completely jettisoned almost immediately because Betty is clearly like very in love with
Hmm.
Bruce Banner still. I like their dynamic, but like the Betty role played by Liv Tyler is pretty thankless in this movie. She's kind of damsel in distress that just loves her man. Doesn't really get that much to do, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And for that reason, this movie does feel kind of like in many ways a relic of the movie was made in 2008, but it feels like a relic of kind of 90s, uh,
Hmm.
80s and 90s action filmmaking in that way.
Yeah,
Um,
but at the same time, I love how committed Liv Tyler is to it, because every moment she's playing like she could burst into tears because of clearly all the stuff that the character has gone through. And another thing I really like about the movie is, and I guess every point we make ends up becoming a criticism about modern Marvel, but everyone in this movie feels like a real person, and not just like the main characters, but like every minor character who shows up as well, whether it's the guy Betty's dating, whether it's Stanley, the pizza shop owner. There's no
mm,
origin, no backstory explained. There's just like, okay, so he clearly knows both of them and has known both Betty and Bruce for a while, and you can tell just by the affection they have um, for each other that, okay, there's a little bit of history there, and it feels so familiar. And in the script, I guess it becomes this thing of like, okay, there's a bit of downtime here. Bruce is no longer on the run. There is some respite. And you really feel it because he gets to sit down and have a conversation with someone who knows him, who understands him. Even if, we've never seen this person before and we're never going to see him again. There is a sense of comfort that kind of radiates. And it reminds me of two scenes in particular. One is a scene in The Americans, and we're not going to talk too much about it because you haven't seen the show yet. But it's when the lead characters, Philip and Elizabeth, meet someone from their past. Again, no details, played by Frank Langella. And it's the first time Frank Langella has showed up in the show. But these characters have decades and decades and decades of history, and you can tell immediately from the moment they greet each other, the playfulness, the warmth, that okay, these are people you believe immediately, people who have known each other for a very long time and know each other intimately. The other scene it reminds me of is the diner scene in Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of the Clones. Um, you're talking to like the world's biggest Dexter Jetster fan here, because so not only did I rewatch the movie quite recently,
It's a huge club. All three of you are in
all
it,
three
I
of us,
think.
it's me, Patrick, and I think my brother. Um, but I watched the movie recently, enjoyed it a lot more than I thought I would. But again, like I firmly believe that Dexter Jetster is one of the most human characters in the prequels just because of the way he behaves around Obi-Wan and humanizes him in the process. So Stanley serves a similar function. Like you get this sense of Bruce Banner's past, even though we don't see that past. We don't see, there's no flashbacks really to his life before becoming the Hulk. Um, but you get a sense of the life that he's lost, the normalcy that he's lost.
I would agree that old man in this movie in restaurant is the Dexter Jetster of the Incredible Hulk. Agreed completely.
Go put it on the poster.
Yeah. So they are, they reunite, and here's another thing that was shocking to me was I actually thought that Emil Blonsky was a very credible and solid villain
Mm-hmm.
until the very end of this movie.
Mm-hmm.
Because basically, like, he has that conversation with Ross where he's like, he's like clearly in awe of the Incredible Hulk. Like, he's clearly amazed by him. And he's like, I wish I could move like that. And also, like, Tim Roth is like great casting because
Mm-hmm.
he's a bit of an older gentleman. Like, you don't expect someone that old kind of to be um, in the field, like doing what he's doing, like just doing the badass stuff that he's doing in this movie
Yeah.
necessarily. Um, and this is brought up in the movie. He's like, why are you still in the field? And he's like, oh, I like it to be where the action, I like to be where the action is,
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm like, this is actually like a pretty solid motivation for why this guy would want the super soldier serum and like why he wanted like become the Abomination. Like that actually all made sense to me in a way that I don't feel like it did when I first watched this movie. But then I got to the end and I'm like, okay, it just gets, now I remember why I have a bad association with this movie, is
Yeah.
because of that stuff at the end.
Yeah. I like the one
Um,
exchange between him and Ross where I think Ross assumes that he's 45, but he's actually 39. But that's not left hanging as a joke. Ross's response to that is, it takes a toll on you. And then
yeah.
again, just that one little exchange gives you so much about these characters and what they do. And, another reason that why Blonsky might want something that is physically invigorating to him, like the super soldier serum.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, Anything else we want to cover about this second act of the movie before we get to kind of the final part of the movie where we had most of our problems? Um, there is
Um,
this big action scene at the school that's
mhm,
like
mhm.
pretty solid.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know why Blonsky is so confident. He like walks straight up to Hulk right at the end, and Hulk kind of kicks him or whatever and
Yeah.
breaks every bone in his body. And it's like, did you really need to taunt him like that? Like, yes, he just got really overconfident with a super soldier serum, basically, right?
Mhm,
And he's like,
mhm.
I can. Is that all you got? It's like, dude, you're still dealing with like a force like the likes of which this planet has never seen before. So maybe just take it easy. But yeah, that felt a little bit silly to me. Like, would Blonsky really be that dumb? But I guess it's just the beginning of him being really stupid for the rest
Yeah.
of the
Yeah.
movie. Um, but I thought it was a cool action scene, and there's some cool ideas in it. The idea, like Hulk, kind of shredding those like the idea of using sonic weaponry against
Hmm.
Hulk is really cool. Hulk like kind of destroying those vehicles is really cool. There's just a lot of cool ideas, cool action ideas in that sequence. So let's talk about the final act. I mean, I think it really kicks off when he meets Mr. Blue, which
Yeah.
bold move to introduce a character in the third act that we don't really know anything about, and but whose actions are critical to the final act of the movie
Yeah.
happening, right?
Yeah, I think
And I,
that's maybe the one thing in this movie that kind of feels like sequel setup. Especially
mm,
given what happens to Mr. Blue at the end. Interesting, like Reservoir Dogs kind of naming there. Um,
mhm.
but he gets a bit of Banner's irradiated blood in his brain, and he gets all mega
I think it's
mindy.
actually is it Banner's blood? I'm pretty sure it's Abomination's blood that he gets in his head.
Oh, maybe.
Yeah.
No, because I
Um,
think he is injecting Banner's blood, some of the stuff that he has
Oh yeah,
worked
yeah, yeah.
on.
He's injecting Banner's blood into
Yeah,
Abomination,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And then some. I don't. Okay, I don't remember if it's Abomination's blood or Banner's blood that gets into his head. But
yeah.
yes,
Basically, some gamma
yeah,
blood,
yeah.
and his head starts getting bigger. And in the comics, that character is a villain named the Leader. His whole deal is big head, big brain, very smart, and also green skin, if I recall. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if he showed up again at some point.
Yeah. But then essentially, what happens is that uh, they actually capture Banner, which
Hmm.
is a shock that they're able to do that. That's like actually a genuinely shocking moment. But then at this point, Tim Roth's character Blonsky is just completely unhinged. Like
Yeah.
he's just making dramatic decision after dramatic decision that doesn't really make any sense, and
Hmm.
you could attribute it to the super soldier serum, which is what I think She-Hulk episode 2 does.
Hmm.
But uh, they experiment with Banner's blood to inject it into Blonsky, and he becomes the Abomination. And there's some, cheesy moments where he's like, "I don't know if it's gonna work. It would be an abomination," like.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, that's pretty campy, and I don't hate it. I don't hate it. So,
Yeah, this
um,
was still back when you couldn't just give superheroes and supervillains, comic book names. You had to kind of, go around it in like a weird way where, like even in Batman Begins, um, you have, I think it's the gangster Carmine Falcone who keeps referring to Dr. Crane as Scarecrow because he's like scared of something. And like, it's not just a mantle that he takes on. He's not like, I'm Scarecrow. It's, you have to find roundabout ways to like justify the comic book stuff.
yeah. So then they have a big fight,
Hmm.
and the fight is okay. It looks like it's shot on a set, like in a backlot somewhere, where it's like on one street,
Hmm.
and you're just watching kind of two big CGI dudes fight each other. And I thought I didn't love it because I will say I liked the idea that they need to let Bruce Banner go. Like that's a cool idea. You've been trying to capture him this whole time, and now you need to let him go. Like that's a cool reversal. And
Hmm.
seeing Ross struggle with that is kind of interesting. But the thing that's sad is that the Abomination in this movie doesn't really represent any idea,
Yeah.
right? He doesn't really represent evil, or I guess he represents like I want more power for myself. Like that's kind of
Hmm.
that's the idea that he represents. But like at that point in time, I'm pretty sure Blonsky is completely wasted on this super serum. Like he's not even really making decisions of his own volition at that point. So you're kind of like, you know, we are meant to believe he's not operating under his normal will. So it's
Hmm.
like when what Bruce Banner is fighting is not even really what Blonsky wants. It's just what this kind of chemical is, and it's like, okay, that's not very interesting dramatically, I think,
Yeah, because even though
and visually because it's just the two CG dudes fighting each other. But go ahead, what are you going to say?
Yeah, no, even though Blonsky is born kind of from the same blood or the same radiation, he would make a much better Captain America villain and a much better like Thor villain because those movies, to an extent, deal with power and how to wield it and the temptation to power, and that's Blonsky's whole deal. Like he covets power. Um, Whereas at the other end of that coin, Bruce Banner isn't someone, who is ever tempted by power. His whole deal in this movie is, trying to get rid of this part of himself. And I guess we're supposed to, in some roundabout way, assume that, okay, him, deciding to jump out of the plane is him embracing this ugly, monstrous part of himself. But it doesn't quite work as like a key moment of drama, because it's not that different from the rest of the movie,
Yeah.
because it's not like he's saying, if I make this decision, I will be the Hulk forever. There's no turning back. This is the point of no return. There's nothing established in the movie that makes this moment kind of a life or death decision or a make or break decision for him. He would have made this same decision probably like at the beginning of the movie too. Um, which is another reason why that whole final act, look, anyway, my eyes kind of glaze over the final act of this movie and of like the first Iron Man. But like in this one especially, it doesn't feel like there's anything really at stake beyond like, who can punch harder. And it is cool that the Hulk uses two halves of a cop car as like boxing gloves,
Yes, that's
but
pretty
it's
awesome.
but it's cool in like a very fleeting kind of way, because nothing
Hmm.
else happens in the
Yeah.
rest of the fight. Because again, there's nothing at stake there. There's no question of like, how far is Banner gonna go? Can he control this? Even though at the very end you have this moment where he's gonna kill Blonsky, and Betty is like no, and he stops. But like the
I
the
thought
rest.
the Betty Hulk relationship was pretty interesting in this movie.
Mhm.
You know, it kind of recalls like King Kong. That whole dynamic as well. But I would agree with you about like dramatically, it feels pretty inert, this
Yeah.
whole ending, and that's a bummer. And you're saying Blonsky desires power, but like to some degree, he only desires power to do the job that has been set up for him. Which is to stop the whole. Like he's like,
Yeah.
yeah, yes, he in that process he gets corrupted, but
Hmm.
he's really just trying to do a job.
Yeah.
Until the very end of the movie.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I would agree that it's just kind of nonsense by the end. Like you're watching CG creatures fight each other, and for reasons that it's like not really clear. And the ultimate disappointment, I think, is Siddhant Thatlaka. We have had dozens of Marvel films at this point, and we had this Incredible Hulk origin story. We had two Hulk movies,
Hmm.
and my understanding of the Incredible Hulk, and you tell me if I'm wrong, because I don't think I've read as much of the comics as you, probably, is that like the idea of the Incredible Hulk like controlling his anger is core to is core to that character. There's two sides to that person, and like
Hmm.
it's kind of like a Jekyll Hyde situation where it's like, oh, there's this part of me and it manifests in this way, and like controlling my anger is controlling this other creature inside me.
Hmm.
I feel like inclusive of this movie, we have not yet gotten a good depiction of
Hmm.
that core idea.
You're right.
There's that moment in the Avengers when he's like, I'm always angry. I'm like, okay, could have fooled me. Like I didn't that that was not set up either in the rest of the Avengers or even in this movie.
Yeah.
Like the anger part was just has always been the most interesting part to me of that character,
Yeah.
and has not been done any justice by any of the films or TV shows, and that's been a huge bummer. And honestly, the best depiction of it would be Ong Lee's Hulk,
Hmm.
which itself has other massive problems.
Yeah. I
But
was gonna say
yeah,
I haven't seen the 2003 Hulk in a while, and I believe we're going to talk about it as we get further into the podcast. But if memory serves, it's the only live action depiction, at least since like the late 80s, early 90s, that has anything to say in terms of what the Hulk is as it relates to Bruce Banner as a character.
yeah,
And you have bits and pieces in the MCU, Hulk stories where it's like, oh, gotta control this thing, but it's fun when it comes out, and and then like the most interesting Hulk stuff happens off screen between Avengers Infinity War and Endgame. This thing of like, oh yeah, yeah, I learned to control the Hulk. Yeah. How? Oh, just don't worry about it. It was between movies, because that is
right,
again like the most fundamental part of this character is these two,
yeah.
warring parts of himself, and the
The most we
reconciliate.
get, honestly, of that whole journey is in She-Hulk Attorney at Law. No joke.
Yeah, and you
So
get references to it, which is the
yeah,
most that they can do at this stage, unfortunately.
yeah. So any other thoughts about the Incredible Hulk? kind of interesting, by the way. At the time, it was like pretty mind blowing, the idea that you'd have these post credit sequences after Iron Man and the Incredible Hulk, and they kind of tie into each other. It's like, ooh, cool, interesting.
Yeah.
Never really got that before, so that was cool.
Did
But
I forgot to sit through the credits this time? Is there an actual like post credit sequence, or it's just like brought forward to the very end of the movie?
yeah, that's the one I was referring to, the one
Yeah,
with
yeah,
Tony
yeah.
Stark. I don't know
Okay.
if there's a post credit
Yeah,
sequence.
because I think they
But yeah,
figured that if they want to do this whole universe building thing, that they need to do it in the movies because now everyone sits through every sort of vaguely franchise related thing to see
yeah.
if there's something more to come. But
But then they came upon the ultimate solution, which is put one in mid credits and also post credits.
pretty much, yeah.
Put the world building one mid credits and put the kind of fun
Yeah.
slight one post credits. That's
Yeah,
what they
that
aligned
I
on.
think
So
was that I think was like set up by the Joss Whedon Avengers movie in 2012, which I
yeah,
believe was shot after the movie premiered, but that's a whole different story. But yeah, so it because just a few months earlier, I believe this came out in June or July of 2008, and it was in early May that audiences first got a taste of um, Robert Downey Jr.'s Tony Stark, and to see him show up here, so blatantly as like the closing image of this movie, it really made you feel like, oh, okay, so this is because it was like the first major superhero crossover in movies, this movie.
yeah,
Because prior to that, like at most you had either these jokey references, or you had, I think it's in Spider-Man 2, you have Thomas Jane's Punisher like in the background of one shot. It's a very blink and you'll miss it kind of thing. This was the first time that they were saying, hey, stay tuned, these things are actually connected to one another.
yeah. And this was also like at a very critical time in Marvel's history.
Hmm.
And they had not, they had some movies before where they were like uh advisors or tangentially involved, but like, as you probably are aware, they had sold off their rights to like all these different studios of all the different characters, and they're like, hey, what if we try making the movies ourselves?
Yeah.
And so um that's what they did. And they needed at least either Iron Man or Incredible Hulk to succeed in order to
Hmm.
justify further investment in it. And this movie didn't do that great. It
Yeah.
made $265 million worldwide. But Iron Man was a huge success. And
Hmm.
now we live in the very transformed world that we live in today. So it's interesting to just reflect on like the one that didn't do as well. But nonetheless, based on She-Hulk episode 2 this week that we're talking about on Decoding TV, still had a massive impact on the MCU.
Yeah.
Whose kind of template, events, legacy, whatever, continues to reverberate.